Chapter 21 of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 21. Help. "Did it take you so long to find it?" asked the lovely person with the smile. "Of course, I knew you would find it in the end, but we had to give ourselves time. How long did it take?" Marco removed himself from beneath the touch of her hand. It was quietly done, but there was a disdain in his young face which made her wince, though she pretended to shrug her shoulders amusedly. "You refuse to answer?" she laughed. "I refuse." At that very moment he saw in the curve of the corridor the Chancellor and his daughter approaching slowly. The two young officers were talking gaily to the girl. They were on their way back to their box. Was he going to lose them? Was he? The delicate hand was laid on his shoulder again, but this time he felt that it grasped him firmly. "Naughty boy," the soft voice said. "I am going to take you home with me. If you struggle, I shall tell these people that you are my bad boy who is here without permission. What will you answer? My escort is coming down the staircase and will help me. Do you see?" And in fact, there appeared in the crowd, at the head of the staircase, the figure of the man he remembered. He did see. A dampness broke out on the palms of his hands. If she did this bold thing, what could he say to those she told her lie to? How could he bring proof or explain who he was? And what story dare he tell? His protestations and struggles would merely amuse the lookers on, who would see in them only the impotent rage of an insubordinate youngster. There swept over him a wave of remembrance which brought back, as if he were living through it again, the moment when he had stood in the darkness of the wine cellar with his back against the door and heard the man walk away and leave him alone. He felt again as he had done then, but now he was in another land and far away from his father. He could do nothing to help himself unless something showed him a way. He made no sound, and the woman who held him saw only a flame leap under his dense black lashes. But something within him called out. It was as if he heard it. It was that strong self, the self that was Marco, and it called. It called as if it shouted. "Help!" it called, to that unknown stranger thing which had made worlds and which he and his father so often talked of and in whose power they so believed. "Help!" The Chancellor was drawing nearer. Perhaps. Should he? "You are too proud to kick and shout," the voice went on, "and people would only laugh. Do you see?" The stairs were crowded, and the man who was at the head of them could only move slowly, but he had seen the boy. Marco turned so that he could face his captor squarely, as if he were going to say something in answer to her, but he was not. Even as he made the movement of turning, the help he had called for came, and he knew what he should do. And he could do two things at once: save himself and give his sign, because, the sign once given, the Chancellor would understand. "He will be here in a moment. He has recognized you," the woman said. As he glanced up the stairs, the delicate grip of her hand unconsciously slackened. Marco whirled away from her. The bell rang which was to warn the audience that they must return to their seats, and he saw the Chancellor hasten his pace. A moment later, the old aristocrat found himself amazedly looking down at the pale face of a breathless lad, who spoke to him in German and in such a manner that he could not but pause and listen. "Sir," he was saying, "the woman in violet at the foot of the stairs is a spy. She trapped me once, and she threatens to do it again. Sir, may I beg you to protect me?" He said it low and fast. No one else could hear his words. "What? What?" the Chancellor exclaimed. And then, Drawing a step nearer, and quite as low and rapidly, but with perfect distinctness, Marco uttered 4 words. "The lamp is lighted." The help cry had been answered instantly. Marco saw it at once in the old man's eyes, notwithstanding that he turned to look at the woman at the foot of the staircase, as if she only concerned him. "What? What?" he said again, and made a movement toward her, pulling his large moustache with a fierce hand. Then Marco recognized that a curious thing happened. The lovely person saw the movement and the gray moustache, and that instant her smile died away and she turned quite white, so white that under the brilliant electric light she was almost green and scarcely looked lovely at all. She made a sign to the man on the staircase and slipped through the crowd like an eel. She was a slim and flexible creature, and never was a disappearance more wonderful in its rapidity. Between stout matrons and their thin or stout escorts and families, she made her way and lost herself, but always making toward the exit. In 2 minutes there was no sight of her violet draperies to be seen. She was gone, and so, evidently, was her male companion. It was plain to Marco that to follow the profession of a spy was not by any means a safe thing. The Chancellor recognized her. She had recognized the Chancellor, who turned looking ferociously angry and spoke to one of the young officers. "She and the man with her are 2 of the most dangerous spies in Europe. She is a Roumanian and he is a Russian. What they wanted of this innocent lad I don't pretend to know. What did she threaten?" to Marco. Marco was feeling rather cold and sick, and had lost his healthy color for the moment. "She said she meant to take me home with her and would pretend I was her son who had come here without permission," he answered. "She believes I know something I do not." He made a hesitating but grateful bow. "The 3rd act, sir. I must not keep you. Thank you. Thank you." The Chancellor moved toward the entrance door of the balcony seats, but he did it with his hand on Marco's shoulder. "See that he gets home safely," he said to the younger of the 2 officers. "Send a messenger with him. He's young to be attacked by creatures of that kind." Polite young officers naturally obey the commands of chancellors and such dignitaries. This one found without trouble a young private who marched with Marco through the deserted streets to his lodgings. He was a stolid young Bavarian peasant, and seemed to have no curiosity or even any interest in the reason for the command given him. He was, in fact, thinking of his sweetheart who lived near Konigsee and who had skated with him on the frozen lake last winter. He scarcely gave a glance to the schoolboy he was to escort. He neither knew nor wondered why. The Rat had fallen asleep over his papers and lay with his head on his folded arms on the table. But he was awakened by Marco's coming into the room, and sat up, blinking his eyes in the effort to get them open. "Did you see him? Did you get near enough?" he drowsed. "Yes," Marco answered. "I got near enough." The Rat sat upright suddenly. "It's not been easy," he exclaimed. "I'm sure something happened. Something went wrong." "Something nearly went wrong. Very nearly," answered Marco. But as he spoke, he took the sketch of the Chancellor out of the slit in his sleeve and tore it and burned it with a match. "But I did get near enough, and that's 2." They talked long before they went to sleep that night. The Rat grew pale as he listened to the story of the woman in violet. "I ought to have gone with you," he said. "I see now. An aide de camp must always be in attendance. It would have been harder for her to manage 2 than 1. I must always be near to watch, even if I am not close by you. If you had not come back, if you had not come back!" He struck his clenched hands together fiercely. "What should I have done?" When Marco turned toward him from the table near which he was standing, he looked like his father. "You would have gone on with the game just as far as you could," he said. "You could not leave it. You remember the places and the faces and the sign. There is some money, And when it was all gone, you could have begged, as we used to pretend we should. We have not had to do it yet, and it was best to save it for country places and villages. But you could have done it if you were obliged to. The game would have to go on." The Rat caught at his thin chest as if he had been struck breathless. "Without you?" he gasped. "Without you?" "Yes," said Marco. "And we must think of it, and plan in case anything like that should happen." He stopped himself quite suddenly, and sat down, looking straight before him as if at some far away thing he saw. "Nothing will happen," he said. "Nothing can." "What are you thinking of?" The Rat gulped, because his breath had not quite come back. "Why will nothing happen?" "Because," the boy spoke in an almost matter-of-fact tone, in quite an unexalted tone at all events, "you see, I can always make a strong call, as I did to-night." "Did you shout?" the Rat asked. "I didn't know you shouted." "I didn't. I said nothing aloud, but the myself that is in me," Marco touched himself on the breast, "called out, 'Help! Help!' with all its strength, and help came." The Rat regarded him dubiously. "What did it call to?" he asked. "To the Power, to the Strength place, to the Thought that does things. The Buddhist hermit who told my father about it called it the Thought that thought the world." A reluctant suspicion betrayed itself in The Rat's eyes. "Do you mean you prayed?" he inquired, with a slight touch of disfavor. Marco's eyes remained fixed upon him in vague thoughtfulness for a moment or so of pause. "I don't know," he said at last. "Perhaps it's the same thing, when you need something so much that you cry out loud for it. But it's not words. It's a strong thing without a name. I called like that when I was shut in the wine cellar. I remembered some of the things the old Buddhist told my father." The Rat moved restlessly. "The help came that time," he admitted. "How did it come to-night?" "In that thought which flashed into my mind almost the next second. It came like lightning. All at once, I knew if I ran to the Chancellor and said the woman was a spy, it would startle him into listening to me, and that then I could give him the sign, and that when I gave him the sign, he would know I was speaking the truth and would protect me." "It was a splendid thought," The Rat said, "and it was quick. But it was you who thought of it." "All thinking is part of the big thought," said Marco slowly. "It knows. It knows. And the outside part of us somehow broke the chain that linked us to it. And we are always trying to mend the chain without knowing it. That is what our thinking is, trying to mend the chain. But we shall find out how to do it sometime. The old Buddhist told my father so, just as the sun was rising from behind a high peak of the Himalayas." Then he added hastily, "I am only telling you what my father told me, and he only told me what the old hermit told him." "Does your father believe what he told him?" The Rat's bewilderment had become an eager and restless thing. "Yes, he believes it. He always thought something like it himself. That is why he is so calm and knows so well how to wait." "Is that it?" breathed The Rat. "Is that why? Has he mended the chain?" And there was awe in his voice because of this one man to whom he felt any achievement was possible. "I believe he has," said Marco. "Don't you think so yourself?" "He has done something," The Rat said. He seemed to be thinking things over before he spoke again, and then even more slowly than Marco. "If he could mend the chain," he said almost in a whisper, "he could find out where the descendant of the Lost Prince is. He would know what to do for Samavia." He ended the words with a start, and his whole face glowed with a new amazed light. "Perhaps he does know!" he cried. "If the help comes like thoughts, as yours did, perhaps his thought of letting us give the sign was part of it. Just we two everyday boys, are part of it." "The old Buddhist said—" began Marco. "Look here," broke in The Rat. "Tell me the whole story. I want to hear it." It was because Loristan had heard it, and listened and believed it, that The Rat had taken fire. His imagination seized upon the idea, as it would have seized on some theory of necromancy proved true and workable. With his elbows on the table and his hands in his hair, he leaned forward, twisting a lock with restless fingers. His breath quickened. "Tell it," he said. "I want to hear it all." "I shall have to tell it in my own words," Marco said, "and it won't be as wonderful as it was when my father told it to me. This is what I remember. My father had gone through much pain and trouble. A great load was upon him, and he had been told he was going to die before his work was done. He had gone to India, because a man he was obliged to speak to had gone there to hunt, and no one knew when he would return. My father followed him for months from one wild place to another, and, when he found him, the man would not hear or believe what he had come so far to say. Then he had jungle fever and almost died. Once the natives left him for dead in a bungalow in the forest, and he heard the jackals howling round him all the night. Through all the hours he was only alive enough to be conscious of two things. All the rest of him seemed gone from his body. His thought knew that his work was unfinished, and his body heard the jackals howl." "Was the work for Samavia?" The Rat put in quickly. "If he had died that night, the descendant of the Lost Prince would never have been found. Never!" The Rat bit his lip so hard that a drop of blood started from it. "When he was slowly coming alive again, a native who had gone back and stayed to wait upon him told him that near the summit of a mountain about 50 miles away there was a ledge which jutted out into space and hung over the valley which was thousands of feet below. On the ledge there was a hut in which there lived an ancient Buddhist who was a holy man, as they called him, and who had been there during time which had not been measured. They said that their grandparents and great-grandparents had known of him, though very few persons had ever seen him. It was told that the most savage beast was tame before him. They said that a man-eating tiger would stop to salute him, and that a thirsty lioness would bring her whelps to drink at the spring near his hut." "That was a lie," said The Rat promptly. Marco neither laughed nor frowned. "How do we know?" he said. "It was a native story, and it might be anything. My father neither said it was true nor false. He listened to all that was told him by natives. They said that the holy man was the brother of the stars. He knew all things past and to come, and could heal the sick. But most people, especially those who had sinful thoughts, were afraid to go near him." "I'd like to have seen." The Rat pondered aloud, but he did not finish. "Before my father was well, he had made up his mind to travel to the ledge if he could. He felt as if he must go. He thought that if he were going to die, the hermit might tell him some wise thing to do for Samavia." "He might have given him a message to leave to the Secret Ones," said The Rat. "He was so weak when he set out on his journey that he wondered if he would reach the end of it. Part of the way he traveled by bullock cart, and part he was carried by natives. But at last the bearers came to a place more than halfway up the mountain and would go no further. Then they went back and left him to climb the rest of the way himself. They had traveled slowly, and he had got more strength, but he was weak yet. The forest was more wonderful than anything he had ever seen. There were tropical trees with foliage like lace, and some with huge leaves, and some of them seemed to reach the sky. Sometimes he could barely see gleams of blue through them, and vines swung down from their high branches and caught each other and matted together, and there were hot scents and strange flowers, and dazzling birds darted about, and thick moss and little cascades bursting out. The path grew narrower and steeper, and the flower scents and the sultriness made it like walking in a hothouse. He heard rustlings in the undergrowth, which might have been made by any kind of wild animal. Once he stepped across a deadly snake without seeing it, but it was asleep and did not hurt him. He knew the natives had been convinced that he would not reach the ledge, but for some strange reason he believed he should. He stopped and rested many times, and he drank some milk he had brought in a canteen. The higher he climbed, the more wonderful everything was, and a strange feeling began to fill him. He said his body stopped being tired and began to feel very light, and his load lifted itself from his heart as if it were not his load any more, but belonged to something stronger. Even Samavia seemed to be safe. As he went higher and higher and looked down the abyss at the world below, it appeared as if it were not real, but only a dream he had wakened from. Only a dream. The Rat moved restlessly. "Perhaps he was light-headed with the fever," he suggested. "The fever had left him, and the weakness had left him," Marco answered. "It seemed as if he had never really been ill at all, as if no one could be ill, because things like that were only dreams, just as the world was. I wish I had been with him. Perhaps I could have thrown these away, down into the abyss." And the Rat shook his crutches, which rested against the table. "I feel as if I was climbing, too. Go on." Marco had become more absorbed than the Rat. He had lost himself in the memory of the story. "I felt that I was climbing when he told me," he said. "I felt as if I were breathing in the hot flower scents and pushing aside the big leaves and giant ferns. There had been a rain, and they were wet and shining with big drops like jewels that showered over him as he thrust his way through and under them. And the stillness and the height, the stillness and the height! I can't make it real to you as he made it to me. I can't. I was there. He took me. And it was so high and so still and so beautiful that I could scarcely bear it." But the truth was that with some vivid boy touch he had carried his hearer far. The Rat was deadly quiet. Even his eyes had not moved. He spoke almost as if he were in a sort of trance. "It's real," he said. "I'm there now, as high as you. Go on. Go on. I want to climb higher." And Marco, understanding, went on. The day was over, and the stars were out when he reached the place where the ledge was. He said he thought that during the last part of the climb he never looked on the earth at all. The stars were so immense that he could not look away from them. They seemed to be drawing him up, and all overhead was like violet velvet, and they hung there like great lamps of radiance. Can you see them? You must see them. My father saw them all night long. They were part of the wonder." "I see them," the Rat answered, still in his trance-like voice and without stirring, and Marco knew he did. And there, with the huge stars watching it, was the hut on the ledge. And there was no one there. The door was open, and outside it was a low bench and a table of stone, and on the table was a meal of dates and rice, waiting. Not far from the hut was a deep spring, which ran away in a clear brook. My father drank and bathed his face there. Then he went out on the ledge and sat down and waited, with his face turned up to the stars. He did not lie down, and he thought he saw the stars all the time he waited. He was sure he did not sleep. He did not know how long he sat there alone, but at last he drew his eyes away from the stars as if he had been commanded to do it, and he was not alone any more. A yard or so away from him sat the holy man. He knew it was the hermit because his eyes were different from any human eyes he had ever beheld. They were as still as the night was, and as deep as the shadows covering the world thousands of feet below, and they had a far, far look, and a strange light was in them. "What did he say?" asked The Rat hoarsely. "He only said, 'Rise, my son. I awaited thee. Go and eat the food I prepared for thee, and then we will speak together.' He didn't move or speak again until my father had eaten the meal. He only sat across on the moss and let his eyes rest on the shadows over the abyss. When my father went back, he made a gesture which meant that he should sit near him. Then he sat still for several minutes and let his eyes rest on my father, until he felt as if the light in them were set in the midst of his own body and his soul. Then he said, 'I cannot tell thee all thou wouldst know. That I may not do.' He had a wonderful, gentle voice, like a deep, soft bell. 'But the work will be done. Thy life and thy son's life will set it on its way.' They sat through the whole night together, and the stars hung quite near, as if they listened. And there were sounds in the bushes of stealthy, padding feet which wandered about as if the owners of them listened too. And the wonderful, low, peaceful voice of the holy man went on and on, telling of wonders which seemed like miracles, but which were to him only the working of the law." "What is the law?" The Rat broke in. "There were two my father wrote down, and I learned them. The first was the law of the One. I'll try to say that." And he covered his eyes and waited through a moment of silence. It seemed to The Rat as if the room held an extraordinary stillness. "Listen," came next. "This is it. There are a myriad worlds. There is but one thought out of which they grew. Its law is order which cannot swerve. Its creatures are free to choose. Only they can create disorder, which in itself is pain and woe and hate and fear. These they alone can bring forth. The Great One is a golden light. It is not remote, but near. Hold thyself within its glow, and thou wilt behold all things clearly. First, with all thy breathing being, know one thing, that thine own thought, when so thou standest, is one with that which thought the worlds." "What?" gasped The Rat. "My thought? The things I think?" "Your thoughts, boys' thoughts, anybody's thoughts. You're giving me the jim-jams." "He said it," answered Marco. "And it was then he spoke about the broken link, and about the greatest books in the world, that in all their different ways, they were only saying over and over again one thing thousands of times. Just this thing: hate not, fear not, love. And he said that was order. And when it was disturbed, suffering came, poverty and misery and catastrophe and wars." "Wars?" The Rat said sharply. "The world couldn't do without war and armies and defenses. What about Samavia?" My father asked him that, and this is what he answered. I learned that too. Let me think again." And he waited as he had waited before. Then he lifted his head. "Listen. This is it. Out of the blackness of disorder and its outpouring of human misery, there will arise the order which is peace. When man learns that he is one with the thought which itself creates all beauty, all power, all splendor, and all repose, he will not fear that his brother can rob him of his heart's desire. He will stand in the light and draw to himself his own." "Draw to himself?" the Rat said. "Draw what he wants? I don't believe it." "Nobody does," said Marco. "We don't know. He said we stood in the dark of the night, without stars, and did not know that the broken chain swung just above us." "I don't believe it," said the Rat. "It's too big." Marco did not say whether he believed it or not. He only went on speaking. "My father listened until he felt as if he had stopped breathing. Just at the stillest of the stillness, the Buddhist stopped speaking, and there was a rustling of the undergrowth a few yards away, as if something big was pushing its way through, and there was the soft pad of feet. The Buddhist turned his head, and my father heard him saying softly, 'Come forth, sister.' And a huge leopardess with 2 cubs walked out onto the ledge and came to him and threw herself down with a heavy lunge near his feet." "Your father saw that?" cried out the Rat. "You mean the old fellow knew something that made wild beasts afraid to touch him or any one near him?" "Not afraid. They knew he was their brother and that he was one with the law. He had lived so long with the great thought that all darkness and fear had left him forever. He had mended the chain." The Rat had reached deep waters. He leaned forward, his hands burrowing in his hair, his face scowling and twisted, his eyes boring into space. He had climbed to the ledge at the mountain top. He had seen the luminous immensity of the stars, and he had looked down into the shadows filling the world thousands of feet below. Was there some remote deep in him from whose darkness a slow light was rising? All that Loristan had said he knew must be true, but the rest of it— Marco got up and came over to him. He looked like his father again. "If the descendant of the Lost Prince is brought back to rule Samavia, he will teach his people the law of the One. It was for that the holy man taught my father until the dawn came." "Who will teach the Lost Prince, the new king, when he is found?" the Rat cried. "Who will teach him?" "The hermit said my father would. He said he would also teach his son, and that son would teach his son, and he would teach his. And through such as they were, the whole world would come to know the order and the law." Never had the Rat looked so strange and fierce a thing. A whole world at peace. No tactics, no battles, no slaughtered heroes, no clash of arms and fame. It made him feel sick, and yet something set his chest heaving. "And your father would teach him that, when he was found, so that he could teach his sons. Your father believes in it?" "Yes," Marco answered. He said nothing but yes. The Rat threw himself forward on the table, face downward. "Then," he said, "he must make me believe it. He must teach me, if he can." They heard a clumping step upon the staircase, and when it reached the landing, it stopped at their door. Then there was a solid knock. When Marco opened the door, the young soldier who had escorted him from the Hoftheater was standing outside. He looked as uninterested and stolid as before, as he handed in a small flat package. "You must have dropped it near your seat at the opera," he said. "I was to give it into your own hands. It is your purse." After he had clumped down the staircase again, Marco and the Rat drew a quick breath at one and the same time. "I had no seat, and I had no purse," Marco said. "Let us open it." There was a flat, limp leather note holder inside. In it was a paper, at the head of which were photographs of the lovely person and her companion. Beneath were a few lines which stated that they were the well-known spies Eugenia Karovna and Paul Varel, and that the bearer must be protected against them. It was signed by the Chief of Police. On a separate sheet was written the command, "Carry this with you as protection." "That is help," the Rat said. "It would protect us even in another country. The Chancellor sent it, but you made the strong call, and it's here." There was no street lamp to shine into their windows when they went at last to bed. When the blind was drawn up, they were nearer the sky than they had been in the Marylebone Road. The last thing each of them saw as he went to sleep was the stars, and in their dreams they saw them grow larger and larger and hang like lamps of radiance against the violet velvet sky above a ledge of a Himalayan mountain, where they listened to the sound of a low voice going on and on and on. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Frances Hodgson Burnett, Chapter 22. A Night Vigil. On a hill in the midst of a great Austrian plain, around which high Alps wait watching through the ages, stands a venerable fortress, almost more beautiful than anything one has ever seen. Perhaps, if it were not for the great plain flowering broadly about it, with its widespread beauties of meadowland, and wood, and dim-toned buildings gathered about farms, and its dream of a small ancient city at its feet, it might, though it is to be doubted, seem something less a marvel of medieval picturesqueness. But out of the plain rises the low hill, and surrounding it, at a stately distance, stands guard the giant majesty of Alps, with shoulders in the clouds and godlike heads above them, looking on, always looking on, sometimes themselves ethereal clouds of snow whiteness, sometimes monster bare crags which pierce the blue, and whose unchanging silence seems to know the secret of the everlasting. And on the hill, which this august circle holds in its embrace, as though it enclosed a treasure, stands the old, old towered fortress built as a citadel for the prince archbishops, who were kings in their domain in the long past centuries, when the splendor and power of ecclesiastical princes was among the greatest upon earth. And as you approach the town, and as you leave it, and as you walk through its streets, the broad, calm, empty-looking ones, or the narrow thoroughfares whose houses seem so near to each other, whether you climb or descend, or cross bridges, or gaze at churches, or step out on your balcony at night to look at the mountains and the moon, always it seems that from some point you can see it gazing down at you. The citadel of Hohensalzburg. It was to Salzburg they went next, because at Salzburg was to be found the man who looked like a hairdresser, and who worked in a barber's shop. Strange as it might seem, to him also must be carried the sign. There may be people who come to him to be shaved, soldiers or men who know things. The Rat worked it out. And he can speak to them when he is standing close to them. It will be easy to get near him. You can go and have your hair cut. The journey from Munich was not a long one, and during the latter part of it they had the wooden-seated third-class carriage to themselves. Even the drowsy old peasant who nodded and slept in one corner got out with his bundles at last. To Marco, the mountains were long-known wonders which could never grow old. They had always and always been so old. Surely they had been the first of the world. Surely they had been standing there waiting when it was said, "Let there be light." The light had known it would find them there. They were so silent, and yet it seemed as if they said some amazing thing, something which would take your breath from you if you could hear it. And they never changed. The clouds changed. They wreathed them and hid them and trailed down them and poured out storm torrents on them and thundered against them and darted forked lightnings round them. But the mountains stood there afterwards as if such things had not been and were not in the world. Winds roared and tore at them. Centuries passed over them. Centuries of millions of lives, of changing of kingdoms and empires, of battles and world-wide fame which grew and died and passed away. And temples crumbled, and kings' tombs were forgotten, and cities were buried, and others built over them after hundreds of years. And perhaps a few stones fell from a mountainside, or a fissure was worn which the people below could not even see. And that was all. There they stood, and perhaps their secret was that they had been there for ever and ever. That was what the mountains said to Marco, which was why he did not want to talk much, but sat and gazed out of the carriage window. The Rat had been very silent all the morning. He had been silent when they got up, and he had scarcely spoken when they made their way to the station at Munich and sat waiting for their train. It seemed to Marco that he was thinking so hard that he was like a person who was far away from the place he stood in. His brows were drawn together, and his eyes did not seem to see the people who passed by. Usually he saw everything and made shrewd remarks on almost all he saw. But today he was somehow otherwise absorbed. He sat in the train with his forehead against the window and stared out. He moved and gasped when he found himself staring at the Alps, but afterwards he was even more strangely still. It was not until after the sleepy old peasant had gathered his bundles and got out at a station that he spoke, and he did it without turning his head. "You only told me one of the two laws," he said. "What was the other one?" Marco brought himself back from his dream of reaching the highest mountain top and seeing clouds float beneath his feet in the sun. He had to come back a long way. "Are you thinking of that? I wondered what you had been thinking about all the morning," he said. "I couldn't stop thinking of it. What was the second one?" said the Rat, but he did not turn his head. "It was called the Law of Earthly Living. It was for every day," said Marco. "It was for the ordering of common things, the small things we think don't matter, as well as the big ones. I always remember that one without any trouble. This was it. Let pass through thy mind, my son, only the image thou wouldst desire to see become a truth. Meditate only upon the wish of thy heart, seeing first that it is such as can wrong no man and is not ignoble. Then will it take earthly form and draw near to thee. This is the law of that which creates." Then the Rat turned round. He had a shrewdly reasoning mind. "That sounds as if you could get anything you wanted if you think about it long enough and in the right way," he said. "But perhaps it only means that, if you do it, you'll be happy after you're dead. My father used to shout with laughing when he was drunk, and talked about things like that and looked at his rags." He hugged his knees for a few minutes. He was remembering the rags, and the fog-darkened room in the slums, and the loud, hideous laughter. "What if you want something that will harm somebody else?" he said next. "What if you hate someone and wish you could kill him?" "That was one of the questions my father asked that night on the ledge. The holy man said people always asked it," Marco answered. "This was the answer." Let him who stretcheth forth his hand to draw the lightning to his brother recall that through his own soul and body will pass the bolt." "Wonder if there's anything in it," the Rat pondered. "It'd make a chap careful if he believed it. Revenging yourself on a man would be like holding him against a live wire to kill him and getting all the volts through yourself." A sudden anxiety revealed itself in his face. "Does your father believe it?" he asked. "Does he?" "He knows it is true," Marco said. "I'll own up," the Rat decided after further reflection. "I'll own up I'm glad that there isn't any one left that I've a grudge against. There isn't any one now." Then he fell again into silence and did not speak until their journey was at an end. As they arrived early in the day, they had plenty of time to wander about the marvelous little old city. But through the wide streets and through the narrow ones, under the archways into the market gardens, across the bridge and into the square where the glockenspiel played its old tinkling tune, everywhere the citadel looked down, and always the Rat walked on in his dream. They found the hairdresser's shop in one of the narrow streets. There were no grand shops there, and this particular shop was a modest one. They walked past it once and then went back. It was a shop so humble that there was nothing remarkable in two common boys going into it to have their hair cut. An old man came forward to receive them. He was evidently glad of their modest patronage. He undertook to attend to the Rat himself, but having arranged him in a chair, he turned about and called to some one in the back room. "Heinrich!" he said. In the slit in Marco's sleeve was the sketch of the man with smooth curled hair, who looked like a hairdresser. They had found a corner in which to take their final look at it before they turned back to come in. Heinrich, who came forth from the small back room, had smooth curled hair. He looked extremely like a hairdresser. He had features like those in the sketch. His nose and mouth and chin and figure were like what Marco had drawn and committed to memory. But he gave Marco a chair and tied the professional white covering round his neck. Marco leaned back and closed his eyes a moment. "This is not the man," he was saying to himself. "He is not the man." How he knew he was not, he could not have explained, but he felt sure. It was a strong conviction. But for the sudden feeling, nothing would have been easier than to give the sign. And if he could not give it now, where was the one to whom it must be spoken? And what would be the result if that one could not be found? And if there were two who were so much alike, how could he be sure? Each owner of each of the pictured faces was a link in a powerful secret chain. And if a link were missed, the chain would be broken. Each time Heinrich came within the line of his vision, he recorded every feature afresh, and compared it with the remembered sketch. Each time the resemblance became more close, but each time some persistent inner conviction repeated, "No, the sign is not for him." It was disturbing, also, to find that the Rat was all at once as restless as he had previously been silent and preoccupied. He moved in his chair, to the great discomfort of the old hairdresser. He kept turning his head to talk. He asked Marco to translate diverse questions he wished him to ask the two men. They were questions about the citadel, about the Monksburg, the residence, the glockenspiel, the mountains. He added one query to another and could not sit still. "The young gentleman will get an ear snipped," said the old man to Marco, "and it will not be my fault." "What shall I do?" Marco was thinking. "He is not the man." He did not give the sign. He must go away and think it out, though where his thoughts would lead him, he did not know. This was a more difficult problem than he had ever dreamed of facing. There was no one to ask advice of, only himself and the Rat, who was nervously wriggling and twisting in his chair. "You must sit still," he said to him. "The hairdresser is afraid you will make him cut you by accident." "But I want to know who lives at the residence," said the Rat. "These men can tell us things if you ask them." "It is done now," said the old hairdresser with a relieved air. "Perhaps the cutting of his hair makes the young gentleman nervous. It is sometimes so." The Rat stood close to Marco's chair and asked questions until Heinrich had also done his work. Marco could not understand his companion's change of mood. He realized that, if he had wished to give the sign, he had been allowed no opportunity. He could not have given it. The restless questioning had so directed the older man's attention to his son and Marco that nothing could have been said to Heinrich without his observing it. "I could not have spoken if he had been the man," Marco said to himself. Their very exit from the shop seemed a little hurried. When they were fairly in the street, the Rat made a clutch at Marco's arm. "You didn't give it," he whispered breathlessly. "I kept talking and talking to prevent you." Marco tried not to feel breathless, and he tried to speak in a low and level voice with no hint of exclamation in it. "Why did you say that?" he asked. The Rat drew closer to him. "That was not the man," he whispered. "It doesn't matter how much he looks like him. He isn't the right one." He was pale and swinging along swiftly as if he were in a hurry. "Let's get into a quiet place," he said. "Those queer things you've been telling me have got hold of me. How did I know? How could I know, unless it's because I've been trying to work that second law? I've been saying to myself that we should be told the right things to do, for the Game and your father, and so that I could be the right sort of aide de camp. I've been working at it, and when he came out, I knew he was not the man in spite of his looks. And I couldn't be sure you knew, and I thought, if I kept on talking and interrupting you with silly questions, you could be prevented from speaking. There's a place not far away where we can get a look at the mountains. Let's go there and sit down," said Marco. "I knew it was not the right one, too. It's the Help over again." "Yes, it's the Help. It's the Help. It must be," muttered the Rat, walking fast and with a pale, set face. "It could not be anything else." They got away from the streets and the people and reached the quiet place where they could see the mountains. There they sat down by the wayside. The Rat took off his cap and wiped his forehead. But it was not only the quick walking which had made it damp. "The queerness of it gave me a kind of fright," he said. "When he came out, and he was near enough for me to see him, a sudden strong feeling came over me. It seemed as if I knew he wasn't the man. Then I said to myself, 'But he looks like him.' And I began to get nervous. And then I was sure again. And then I wanted to try to stop you from giving him the sign. And then it all seemed foolishness. And the next second, all the things you had told me rushed back to me at once, and I remembered what I had been thinking ever since, and I said, 'Perhaps it's the law beginning to work,' and the palms of my hands got moist." Marco was very quiet. He was looking at the farthest and highest peaks and wondering about many things. "It was the expression of his face that was different," he said, "and his eyes. They were rather smaller than the right man's are. The light in the shop was poor, and it was not until the last time he bent over me that I found out what I had not seen before. His eyes are gray. The other ones are brown." "Did you see that?" the Rat exclaimed. "Then we're sure. We're safe." "We're not safe till we've found the right man," Marco said. "Where is he? Where is he? Where is he?" He said the words dreamily and quietly, as if he were lost in thought, but also rather as if he expected an answer. And he still looked at the far-off peaks. The Rat, after watching him a moment or so, began to look at them also. They were like a lodestone to him too. There was something stilling about them, and when your eyes had rested upon them a few moments, they did not want to move away. "There must be a ledge up there somewhere," he said at last. "Let's go up and look for it, and sit there and think about finding the right man." There seemed nothing fantastic in this to Marco. To go into some quiet place and sit and think about the thing he wanted to remember or to find out was an old way of his. To be quiet was always the best thing, his father had taught him. It was like listening to something which could speak without words. "There is a little train which goes up the Geisberg," he said. "When you are at the top, a world of mountains spreads around you. Lazarus went once, and he told me. And we can lie out on the grass all night. Let us go, aide de camp." So they went, each one thinking the same thought, and each boy mind holding its own vision. Marco was the calmer of the two, because his belief that there was always help to be found was an accustomed one, and had ceased to seem to partake of the supernatural. He believed quite simply that it was the working of a law, not the breaking of one, which gave answer and led him in his quests. The Rat, who had known nothing of laws other than those administered by police courts, was at once awed and fascinated by the suggestion of crossing some borderland of the unknown. The law of the one had baffled and overthrown him, with its sweeping away of the enmities of passions which created wars and called for armies. But the law of earthly living seemed to offer practical benefits if you could hold on to yourself enough to work it. "You wouldn't get everything for nothing, as far as I can make out," he had said to Marco. "You'd have to sweep all the rubbish out of your mind. Sweep it as if you did it with a broom. And then keep on thinking straight and believing you were going to get things and working for them, and they'd come." Then he had laughed a short, ugly laugh, because he recalled something. "There was something in the Bible that my father used to jeer about. Something about a man getting what he prayed for if he believed it," he said. "Oh, yes, it's there," said Marco, "that if a man pray believing he shall receive what he asks, it shall be given him. All the books say something like it. It has been said so often, it makes you believe it." "He didn't believe it, and I didn't," said the Rat. "Nobody does, really," answered Marco, as he had done once before. "It's because we don't know." They went up the Geisberg in the little train, which pushed and dragged and panted slowly upward with them. It took them with it stubbornly, and gradually higher and higher, until it had left Salzburg and the citadel below, and had reached the world of mountains which rose and spread and lifted great heads behind each other and beside each other and beyond each other, until there seemed no other land on earth but that on mountain sides and backs and shoulders and crowns. And also one felt the absurdity of living upon flat ground, where life must be an insignificant thing. There were only a few sightseers in the small carriages, and they were going to look at the view from the summit. They were not in search of a ledge. The Rat and Marco were. When the little train stopped at the top, they got out with the rest. They wandered about with them over the short grass on the treeless summit and looked out from this viewpoint and the other. The Rat grew more and more silent, and his silence was not merely a matter of speechlessness, but of expression. He looked silent, and as if he were no longer aware of the earth. They left the sightseers at last and wandered away by themselves. They found a ledge where they could sit or lie, and where even the world of mountains seemed below them. They had brought some simple food with them, and they laid it behind a jutting bit of rock. When the sightseers boarded the laboring little train again and were dragged back down the mountain, their night of vigil would begin. That was what it was to be, a night of stillness on the heights, where they could wait and watch and hold themselves ready to hear any thought which spoke to them. The Rat was so thrilled that he would not have been surprised if he had heard a voice from the place of the stars. But Marco only believed that in this great stillness and beauty, if he held his boy soul quiet enough, he should find himself at last thinking of something that would lead him to the place which held what it was best that he should find. The people returned to the train, and it set out upon its way down the steepness. They heard it laboring on its way, as though it was forced to make as much effort to hold itself back as it had made to drag itself upward. Then they were alone, and it was aloneness such as an eagle might feel when it held itself poised high in the curve of blue. And they sat and watched. They saw the sun go down, and, shade by shade, deepen and make radiant and then draw away with it the last touches of color, rose gold, rose purple, and rose gray. One mountain top after another held its blush a few moments and lost it. It took long to gather them all, but at length they were gone, and the marvel of night fell. The breath of the forests below was sweet about them, and soundlessness enclosed them, which was of unearthly peace. The stars began to show themselves, and presently the two who waited found their faces turned upward to the sky, and they both were speaking in whispers. "The stars look large here," the Rat said. "Yes," answered Marco. "We are not as high as the Buddhist was, but it seems like the top of the world." "There is a light on the side of the mountain yonder, which is not a star," the Rat whispered. "It is a light in a hut where the guides take the climbers to rest and to spend the night," answered Marco. "It is so still," the Rat whispered again after a silence, and Marco whispered back, "It is so still." They had eaten their meal of black bread and cheese after the setting of the sun, and now they lay down on their backs and looked up until the first few stars had multiplied themselves into myriads. They began a little low talk, but the soundlessness was stronger than themselves. "How am I going to hold on to that second law?" the Rat said restlessly. "Let pass through thy mind only the image thou wouldst see become a truth. The things that are passing through my mind are not the things I want to come true. What if we don't find him? Don't find the right one, I mean?" "Lie still, still, and look up at the stars," whispered Marco. "They give you a sure feeling." There was something in the curious serenity of him which calmed even his aide-de-camp. The Rat lay still and looked, and looked, and thought. And what he thought of was the desire of his heart. The soundlessness enwrapped him, and there was no world left. That there was a spark of light in the mountain climber's rest hut was a thing forgotten. They were only two boys, and they had begun their journey on the earliest train, and had been walking about all day and thinking of great and anxious things. "It is so still," the Rat whispered again at last. "It is so still," whispered Marco. And the mountains rising behind each other, and beside each other, and beyond each other in the night, and also the myriads of stars which had so multiplied themselves, looking down knew that they were asleep, as sleep the human beings which do not watch forever. "Some one is smoking," Marco found himself saying in a dream. After which he awakened, and found that the smoke was not part of a dream at all. It came from the pipe of a young man who had an alpenstock and who looked as if he had climbed to see the sun rise. He wore the clothes of a climber, and a green hat with a tuft at the back. He looked down at the two boys, surprised. "Good day," he said. "Did you sleep here so that you could see the sun get up?" "Yes," answered Marco. "Were you cold?" "We slept too soundly to know, and we brought our thick coats." "I slept halfway down the mountains," said the smoker. "I am a guide these days, but I have not been one long enough to miss a sunrise it is no work to reach. My father and brother think I am mad about such things. They would rather stay in their beds. Oh, he is awake, is he?" Turning toward the Rat, who had risen on one elbow and was staring at him. "What is the matter? You look as if you were afraid of me." Marco did not wait for the Rat to recover his breath and speak. "I know why he looks at you so," he answered for him. "He is startled. Yesterday we went to a hairdresser's shop down below there, and we saw a man who was almost exactly like you, only," he added, looking up, "his eyes were gray and yours are brown." "He was my twin brother," said the guide, puffing at his pipe cheerfully. "My father thought he could make hairdressers of us both, and I tried it for 4 years. But I always wanted to be climbing the mountains, and there were not holidays enough. So I cut my hair and washed the pomade out of it and broke away. I don't look like a hairdresser now, do I?" He did not. Not at all. But Marco knew him. He was the man. There was no one on the mountain top but themselves, and the sun was just showing a rim of gold above the farthest and highest giant's shoulders. One need not be afraid to do anything, since there was no one to see or hear. Marco slipped the sketch out of the slit in his sleeve. He looked at it, and he looked at the guide, and then he showed it to him. "That is not your brother. It is you," he said. The man's face changed a little. More than any other face had changed when its owner had been spoken to. On a mountain top, as the sun rises, one is not afraid. "The lamp is lighted," said Marco. "The lamp is lighted." "God be thanked!" burst forth the man, and he took off his hat and bared his head. Then the rim behind the mountain's shoulder leaped forth into a golden torrent of splendor, and the Rat stood up, resting his weight on his crutches in utter silence, and stared and stared. "That is 3," said Marco. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 23. The Silver Horn. During the next week, which they spent in journeying towards Vienna, they gave the sign to 3 different persons at places which were on the way. In a village across the frontier in Bavaria, they found a giant of an old man sitting on a bench under a tree before his mountain Gasthaus or inn. And when the 4 words were uttered, he stood up and bared his head, as the guide had done. When Marco gave the sign in some quiet place to a man who was alone, he noticed that they all did this and said their "God be thanked" devoutly, as if it were part of some religious ceremony. In a small town a few miles away, he had to search some hours before he found a stalwart young shoemaker with bright red hair and a horseshoe-shaped scar on his forehead. He was not in his workshop when the boys first passed it, because, as they found out later, he had been climbing a mountain the day before and had been detained in the descent because his companion had hurt himself. When Marco went in and asked him to measure him for a pair of shoes, he was quite friendly and told them all about it. "There are some good fellows who should not climb," he said. "When they find themselves standing on a bit of rock jutting out over emptiness, their heads begin to whirl around, and then, if they don't turn head over heels a few thousand feet, it is because some comrade is near enough to drag them back. There can be no ceremony then, and they sometimes get hurt, as my friend did yesterday." "Did you never get hurt yourself?" the Rat asked. "When I was 8 years old, I did that," said the young shoemaker, touching the scar on his forehead. "But it was not much. My father was a guide and took me with him. He wanted me to begin early. There is nothing like it, climbing. I shall be at it again. This won't do for me. I tried shoemaking because I was in love with a girl who wanted me to stay at home. She married another man. I am glad of it. Once a guide, always a guide." He knelt down to measure Marco's foot, and Marco bent a little forward. "The lamp is lighted," he said. There was no one in the shop, but the door was open and people were passing in the narrow street, so the shoemaker did not lift his red head. He went on measuring. "God be thanked," he said in a low voice. "Do you want these shoes really, or did you only want me to take your measure?" "I cannot wait until they are made," Marco answered. "I must go on." "Yes, you must go on," answered the shoemaker. "But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make them and keep them. Some great day might come when I shall show them to people and swagger about them." He glanced round cautiously and then ended, still bending over his measuring. "They will be called the shoes of the bearer of the sign, and I shall say, 'He was only a lad. This was the size of his foot.'" Then he stood up with a great smile. "There'll be climbing enough to be done now," he said, "and I look to see you again somewhere." When the boys went away, they talked it over. "The hairdresser didn't want to be a hairdresser, and the shoemaker didn't want to make shoes," said The Rat. "They both wanted to be mountain climbers. There are mountains in Samavia and mountains on the way to it. You showed them to me on the map." "Yes, and secret messengers who can climb anywhere and cross dangerous places and reconnoiter from points no one else can reach, can find out things and give signals other men cannot," said Marco. "That's what I thought out," The Rat answered. "That was what he meant when he said, 'There will be climbing enough to be done now.'" Strange were the places they went to, and curiously unlike each other were the people to whom they carried their message. The most singular of all was an old woman who lived in so remote a place that the road which wound round and round the mountain wound round it for miles and miles. It was not a bad road, and it was an amazing one to travel, dragged in a small cart by a mule, when one could be dragged, and clambering slowly with rests between when one could not. The tree-covered precipices one looked down, the tossing whiteness of waterfalls, or the green foaming of rushing streams, and the immensity of farm and village scattered plains spreading themselves to the feet of other mountains shutting them in, were breathtaking beauties to look down on, as the road mounted and wound round and round, higher and higher. "How can any one live higher than this?" said The Rat, as they sat on the thick moss by the wayside after the mule and cart had left them. "Look at the bare crags looming up above there. Let us look at her again. Her picture looked as if she were 100 years old." Marco took out his hidden sketch. It seemed surely one of the strangest things in the world that a creature as old as this one seemed could reach such a place, or, having reached it, could ever descend to the world again to give aid to any person or thing. Her old face was crossed and recrossed with 1,000 wrinkles. Her profile was splendid yet, and she had been a beauty in her day. Her eyes were like an eagle's, and not an old eagle's, and she had a long neck which held her old head high. "How could she get here?" exclaimed The Rat. "Those who sent us know, though we don't," said Marco. "Will you sit here and rest while I go on further?" "No," The Rat answered stubbornly. "I didn't train myself to stay behind. But we shall come to bare rock climbing soon, and then I shall be obliged to stop." And he said the last bitterly. He knew that, if Marco had come alone, he would have ridden in no cart but would have trudged upward and onward sturdily to the end of his journey. But they did not reach the crags, as they had thought must be inevitable. Suddenly, halfway to the sky, as it seemed, they came to a bend in the road and found themselves mounting into a new green world. An astonishing marvel of a world, with green velvet slopes and soft meadows and thick woodland and cows feeding in velvet pastures. And, as if it had been snowed down from the huge bare mountain crags which still soared above into heaven, a mysterious, ancient, huddled village which, being thus snowed down, might have caught among the rocks and rested there through all time. There it stood. There it huddled itself, and the monsters in the blue above it themselves looked down upon it as if it were an incredible thing, this ancient, steep-roofed, hanging balconied, crumbling cluster of human nests, which seemed 1,000 miles from the world. Marco and The Rat stood and stared at it. Then they sat down and stared at it. "How did it get here?" The Rat cried. Marco shook his head. He certainly could see no explanation of its being there. Perhaps some of the oldest villagers could tell stories of how its first chalets had gathered themselves together. An old peasant driving a cow came down a steep path. He looked with a dull curiosity at The Rat and his crutches, but when Marco advanced and spoke to him in German, he did not seem to understand, but shook his head, saying something in a sort of dialect Marco did not know. "If they all speak like that, we shall have to make signs when we want to ask anything," The Rat said. "What will she speak?" "She will know the German for the sign, or we should not have been sent here," answered Marco. "Come on." They made their way to the village, which huddled itself together, evidently with the object of keeping itself warm when through the winter months the snows strove to bury it and the winds roared down from the huge mountain crags and tried to tear it from among its rocks. The doors and windows were few and small, and glimpses of the inside of the houses showed earthen floors and dark rooms. It was plain that it was counted a more comfortable thing to live without light than to let in the cold. It was easy enough to reconnoiter. The few people they saw were evidently not surprised that strangers who discovered their unexpected existence should be curious and want to look at them and their houses. The boys wandered about as if they were casual explorers, who, having reached the place by chance, were interested in all they saw. They went into the little Gasthaus and got some black bread and sausage and some milk. The mountaineer owner was a brawny fellow who understood some German. He told them that few strangers knew of the village, but that bold hunters and climbers came for sport. In the forests on the mountainsides were bears, and, in the high places, chamois. Now and again some great gentlemen came with parties of the daring kind. Very great gentlemen indeed, he said, shaking his head with pride. There was one who had castles in other mountains, but he liked best to come here. Marco began to wonder if several strange things might not be true, if great gentlemen sometimes climbed to the mysterious place. But he had not been sent to give the sign to a great gentleman. He had been sent to give it to an old woman, with eyes like an eagle which was young. He had a sketch in his sleeve, with that of her face, and of her steep-roofed, black-beamed, balconied house. If they walked about a little, they would be sure to come upon it in this tiny place. Then he could go in and ask her for a drink of water. They roamed about for an hour after they left the Gasthaus. They went into the little church and looked at the graveyard, and wondered if it was not buried out of all sight in the winter. After they had done this, they sauntered out and walked through the huddled clusters of houses, examining each one as they drew near it and passed. "I see it!" The Rat exclaimed at last. "It is that very old-looking one standing a little way from the rest. It is not as tumbled down as most of them, and there are some red flowers on the balcony." "Yes, that's it," said Marco. They walked up to the low black door, and as he stopped on the threshold, Marco took off his cap. He did this because, sitting in the doorway on a low wooden chair, the old woman with the eagle eyes was sitting knitting. There was no one else in the room, and no one anywhere within sight. When the old woman looked up at him with her young eagle's eyes, holding her head high on her long neck, Marco knew he need not ask for water or for anything else. "The lamp is lighted," he said in his low but strong and clear young voice. She dropped her knitting upon her knees and gazed at him a moment in silence. She knew German, it was clear, for it was in German she answered him. "God be thanked!" she said. "Come in, young bearer of the sign, and bring your friend in with you. I live alone and not a soul is within hearing." She was a wonderful old woman. Neither Marco nor The Rat would live long enough to forget the hours they spent in her strange dark house. She kept them and made them spend the night with her. "It is quite safe," she said. "I live alone since my man fell into the crevasse and was killed because his rope broke when he was trying to save his comrade. So I have 2 rooms to spare, and sometimes climbers are glad to sleep in them. Mine is a good warm house, and I am well known in the village. You are very young," she added, shaking her head. "You are very young. You must have good blood in your veins to be trusted with this." "I have my father's blood," answered Marco. "You are like some one I once saw," the old woman said, and her eagle eyes set themselves hard upon him. "Tell me your name." There was no reason why he should not tell it to her. "It is Marco Loristan," he said. "What? It is that?" she cried out, not loud but low. To Marco's amazement, she got up from her chair and stood before him, showing what a tall old woman she really was. There was a startled, even an agitated look in her face. And suddenly she actually made a sort of curtsy to him, bending her knee as peasants do when they pass a shrine. "It is that!" she said again. "And yet they dare let you go on a journey like this. That speaks for your courage and for theirs." But Marco did not know what she meant. Her strange obeisance made him feel awkward. He stood up because his training had told him that when a woman stands, a man also rises. "The name speaks for the courage," he said, "because it is my father's." She watched him almost anxiously. "You do not even know," she breathed, and it was an exclamation and not a question. "I know what I have been told to do," he answered, "and I do not ask anything else." "Who is that?" she asked, pointing to The Rat. "He is the friend my father sent with me," said Marco, smiling. "He called him my aide de camp. It was a sort of joke because we had played soldiers together." It seemed as if she were obliged to collect her thoughts. She stood with her hand at her mouth, looking down at the earth floor. "God guard you," she said at last. "You are very young." "But all his years," The Rat broke in, "he has been in training for just this thing. He did not know it was training, but it was. A soldier who had been trained for 13 years would know his work." He was so eager that he forgot she could not understand English. Marco translated what he said into German and added, "What he says is true." She nodded her head, still with questioning and anxious eyes. "Yes, yes," she muttered, "but you are very young." Then she asked in a hesitating way, "Will you not sit down until I do?" "No," answered Marco. "I would not sit while my mother or grandmother stood." "Then I must sit and forget," she said. She passed her hand over her face, as though she were sweeping away the sudden, puzzled trouble in her expression. Then she sat down, as if she had obliged herself to become again the old peasant she had been when they entered. "All the way up the mountain you wondered why an old woman should be given the Sign," she said. "You asked each other how she could be of use." Neither Marco nor The Rat said anything. "When I was young and fresh," she went on, "I went to a castle over the frontier to be foster mother to a child who was born a great noble, one who was near the throne. He loved me, and I loved him. He was a strong child, and he grew up a great hunter and climber. When he was not 10 years old, my man taught him to climb. He always loved these mountains better than his own. He comes to see me as if he were only a young mountaineer. He sleeps in the room there," with a gesture over her shoulder into the darkness. "He has great power, and, if he chooses to do a thing, he will do it, just as he will attack the biggest bear or climb the most dangerous peak. He is one who can bring things about. It is very safe to talk in this room." Then all was quite clear. Marco and The Rat understood. No more was said about the sign. It had been given, and that was enough. The old woman told them that they must sleep in one of her bedrooms. The next morning one of her neighbors was going down to the valley with a cart, and he would help them on their way. The Rat knew that she was thinking of his crutches, and he became restless. "Tell her," he said to Marco, "how I have trained myself until I can do what any one else can. And tell her I am growing stronger every day. Tell her I'll show her what I can do. Your father wouldn't have let me come as your aide if I hadn't proved to him that I wasn't a cripple. Tell her. She thinks I'm no use." Marco explained, and the old woman listened attentively. When The Rat got up and swung himself about up and down the steep path near her house, she seemed relieved. His extraordinary dexterity and firm swiftness evidently amazed her and gave her a confidence she had not felt at first. "If he has taught himself to be like that just for love of your father, he will go to the end," she said. "It is more than one could believe that a pair of crutches could do such things." The Rat was pacified, and could afterwards give himself up to watching her as closely as he wished to. He was soon working out certain things in his mind. What he watched was her way of watching Marco. It was as if she were fascinated and could not keep her eyes from him. She told them stories about the mountains and the strangers who came to climb with guides or to hunt. She told them about the storms, which sometimes seemed about to put an end to the little world among the crags. She described the winter when the snow buried them, and the strong ones were forced to dig out the weak, and some lived for days under the masses of soft whiteness, glad to keep their cows or goats in their rooms that they might share the warmth of their bodies. The villagers were forced to be good neighbors to each other, for the man who was not ready to dig out a hidden chimney or buried door today might be left to freeze and starve in his snow tomb the next week. Through the worst part of the winter no creature from the world below could make way to them to find out whether they were all dead or alive. While she talked, she watched Marco as if she were always asking herself some question about him. The Rat was sure that she liked him and greatly admired his strong body and good looks. It was not necessary for him to carry himself slouchingly in her presence, and he looked glowing and noble. There was a sort of reverence in her manner when she spoke to him. She reminded him of Lazarus more than once. When she gave them their evening meal, she insisted on waiting on him with a certain respectful ceremony. She would not sit at table with him, and The Rat began to realize that she felt that he himself should be standing to serve him. "She thinks I ought to stand behind your chair as Lazarus stands behind your father's," he said to Marco. "Perhaps an aide ought to do it. Shall I? I believe it would please her." "A bearer of the sign is not a royal person," answered Marco. "My father would not like it, and I should not. We are only two boys." It was very wonderful when, after their supper was over, they all three sat together before the fire. The red glow of the bed of wood coal and the orange yellow of the flame from the big logs filled the room with warm light, which made a mellow background for the figure of the old woman as she sat in her low chair and told them more and more enthralling stories. Her eagle eyes glowed, and her long neck held her head splendidly high as she described great feats of courage and endurance, or almost superhuman daring in aiding those in awesome peril, And when she glowed most in the telling, they always knew that the hero of the adventure had been her foster child, who was the baby born a great noble and near the throne. To her, he was the most splendid and adorable of human beings. Almost an emperor, but so warm and tender of heart that he never forgot the long past days when she had held him on her knee and told him tales of chamois and bear hunting and of the mountain tops in midwinter. He was her sun god. "Yes, yes," she said. "Good mother, he calls me. And I bake him a cake on the hearth, as I did when he was 10 years old and my man was teaching him to climb. And when he chooses that a thing shall be done, done it is. He is a great lord." The flames had died down and only the big bed of red coal made the room glow, and they were thinking of going to bed when the old woman started very suddenly, turning her head as if to listen. Marco and The Rat heard nothing, but they saw that she did, and they sat so still that each held his breath. So there was utter stillness for a few moments. Utter stillness. Then they did hear something, a clear silver sound, piercing the pure mountain air. The old woman sprang upright with the fire of delight in her eyes. "It is his silver horn!" she cried out, striking her hands together. "It is his own call to me when he is coming. He has been hunting somewhere and wants to sleep in his good bed here. Help me to put on more faggots," to The Rat, "so that he will see the flame of them through the open door as he comes." "Shall we be in the way?" said Marco. "We can go at once." She was going towards the door to open it, and she stopped a moment and turned. "No, no," she said. "He must see your face. He will want to see it. I want him to see how young you are." She threw the door wide open, and they heard the silver horn send out its gay call again. The brushwood and faggots The Rat had thrown on the coals crackled and sparkled and roared into fine flames, which cast their light into the road and threw out in fine relief the old figure which stood on the threshold and looked so tall. And in but a few minutes her great lord came to her. And in his green hunting suit, with its green hat and eagle's feather, he was as splendid as she had said he was. He was big and royal looking and laughing, and he bent and kissed her as if he had been her own son. "Yes, good mother," they heard him say. "I want my warm bed and one of your good suppers. I sent the others to the Gasthaus." He came into the redly glowing room, and his head almost touched the blackened rafters. Then he saw the two boys. "Who are these, good mother?" he asked. She lifted his hand and kissed it. "They are the bearers of the sign," she said rather softly. "The lamp is lighted." Then his whole look changed. His laughing face became quite grave, and for a moment looked even anxious. Marco knew it was because he was startled to find them only boys. He made a step forward to look at them more closely. "The lamp is lighted, and you two bear the sign!" he exclaimed. Marco stood out in the fire glow that he might see him well. He saluted with respect. "My name is Marco Loristan, Highness," he said, "and my father sent me." The change which came upon his face then was even greater than at first. For a second Marco even felt that there was a flash of alarm in it. But almost at once that passed. "Loristan is a great man and a great patriot," he said. "If he sent you, it is because he knows you are the one safe messenger. He has worked too long for Samavia not to know what he does." Marco saluted again. He knew what it was right to say next. "If we have your Highness's permission to retire," he said, "we will leave you and go to bed. We go down the mountain at sunrise." "Where next?" asked the hunter, looking at him with curious intentness. "To Vienna, Highness," Marco answered. His questioner held out his hand, still with the intent interest in his eyes. "Good night, fine lad," he said. "Samavia has need to vaunt itself on its sign bearer. God go with you." He stood and watched him as he went toward the room in which he and his aide de camp were to sleep. The Rat followed him closely. At the little back door the old woman stood, having opened it for them. As Marco passed and bade her good night, he saw that she again made the strange obeisance, bending the knee as he went by. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 24. How shall we find him? In Vienna they came upon a pageant. In celebration of a century-past victory, the Emperor drove in state and ceremony to attend at the great cathedral and to do honor to the ancient banners and laurel-wreathed statue of a long-dead soldier prince. The broad pavements of the huge chief thoroughfare were crowded with a cheering populace, watching the martial pomp and splendor as it passed by with marching feet, prancing horses, and glitter of scabbard and chain, which all seemed somehow part of music in triumphant bursts. The Rat was enormously thrilled by the magnificence of the imperial place. Its immense spaces, the squares and gardens, reigned over by statues of emperors and warriors and queens, made him feel that all things on earth were possible. The palaces and stately piles of architecture, whose surmounting equestrian bronzes ramped high in the air, clear-cut and beautiful against the sky, seemed to sweep out of his world all atmosphere but that of splendid cities down whose broad avenues emperors rode, with waving banners, tramping, jangling soldiery before and behind, and golden trumpets blaring forth. It seemed as if it must always be like this, that lances and cavalry and emperors would never cease to ride by. "I should like to stay here a long time," he said, almost as if he were in a dream. "I should like to see it all." He leaned on his crutches in the crowd and watched the glitter of the passing pageant. Now and then he glanced at Marco, who watched also with a steady eye which, the Rat saw, nothing would escape. How absorbed he always was in the game! How impossible it was for him to forget it, or to remember it only as a boy would! Often it seemed that he was not a boy at all, and the game, the Rat knew in these days, was a game no more, but a thing of deep and deadly earnest, a thing which touched kings and thrones, and concerned the ruling and swaying of great countries. And they, two lads pushed about by the crowd as they stood and stared at the soldiers, carried with them that which was even now lighting the lamp. The blood in the Rat's veins ran quickly and made him feel hot as he remembered certain thoughts which had forced themselves into his mind during the past weeks. As his brain had the trick of working things out, it had, during the last fortnight at least, been following a wonderful, even if rather fantastic and feverish fancy. A mere trifle had set it at work, but, its labor once begun, things which might once have seemed to be trifles appeared so no longer. When Marco was asleep, the Rat lay awake through thrilled and sometimes almost breathless midnight hours, looking backward and recalling every detail of their lives since they had known each other. Sometimes it seemed to him that almost everything he remembered, the game from first to last above all, had pointed to but one thing. And then again, he would all at once feel that he was a fool and had better keep his head steady. Marco, he knew, had no wild fancies. He had learned too much, and his mind was too well balanced. He did not try to "work out things." He only thought of what he was under orders to do. "But," said the Rat, more than once in these midnight hours, "if it ever comes to a draw whether he is to be saved or I am, he is the one that must come to no harm. Killing can't take long, and his father sent me with him." This thought passed through his mind as the tramping feet went by. As a sudden splendid burst of approaching music broke upon his ear, a queer look twisted his face. He realized the contrast between this day and that first morning behind the churchyard, when he had sat on his platform among the squad and looked up and saw Marco in the arch at the end of the passage. And because he had been good-looking and had held himself so well, he had thrown a stone at him. Yes, blind, gutter-bred fool that he'd been, his first greeting to Marco had been a stone, just because he was what he was. As they stood here in the crowd in this far-off foreign city, it did not seem as if it could be true that it was he who had done it. He managed to work himself closer to Marco's side. "Isn't it splendid?" he said. "I wish I was an emperor myself. I'd have these fellows out like this every day." He said it only because he wanted to say something, to speak, as a reason for getting closer to him. He wanted to be near enough to touch him and feel that they were really together, and that the whole thing was not a sort of magnificent dream from which he might awaken to find himself lying on his heap of rags in his corner of the room in Bone Court. The crowd swayed forward in its eagerness to see the principal feature of the pageant, the Emperor in his carriage. The Rat swayed forward with the rest, to look as it passed. A handsome, white-haired and mustached personage in splendid uniform decorated with jeweled orders and with a cascade of emerald green plumes nodding in his military hat, gravely saluted the shouting people on either side. By him sat a man uniformed, decorated, and emerald plumed also, but many years younger. Marco's arm touched the Rat's almost at the same moment that his touched Marco. Under the nodding plumes, each saw the rather tired and cynical pale face, a sketch of which was hidden in the slit in Marco's sleeve. "Is the one who sits with the Emperor an Archduke?" Marco asked the man nearest to him in the crowd. The man answered amiably enough. No, he was not, but he was a certain prince, a descendant of the one who was the hero of the day. He was a great favorite of the Emperor's, and was also a great personage, whose palace contained pictures celebrated throughout Europe. "He pretends it is only pictures he cares for," he went on, shrugging his shoulders and speaking to his wife, who had begun to listen. "But he is a clever one, who amuses himself with things he professes not to concern himself about, big things. It's his way to look bored and interested in nothing. But it's said he's a wizard for knowing dangerous secrets." "Does he live at the Hofburg with the Emperor?" asked the woman, craning her neck to look after the imperial carriage. "No, but he's often there. The Emperor is lonely and bored too, no doubt, and this one has ways of making him forget his troubles. It's been told me that now and then the two dress themselves roughly, like common men, and go out into the city to see what it's like to rub shoulders with the rest of the world. I dare say it's true. I should like to try it myself once in a while, if I had to sit on a throne and wear a crown." The two boys followed the celebration to its end. They managed to get near enough to see the entrance to the church where the service was held, and to get a view of the ceremonies at the banner-draped and laurel-wreathed statue. They saw the man with the pale face several times, but he was always so enclosed that it was not possible to get within yards of him. It happened once, however, that he looked through a temporary break in the crowding people and saw a dark, strong-featured and remarkably intent boy's face, whose vivid scrutiny of him caught his eye. There was something in the fixedness of its attention which caused him to look at it curiously for a few seconds, and Marco met his gaze squarely. "Look at me! Look at me!" the boy was saying to him mentally. "I have a message for you. A message!" The tired eyes in the pale face rested on him with a certain growing light of interest and curiosity. But the crowding people moved, and the temporary break closed up, so that the two could see each other no more. Marco and the Rat were pushed backward by those taller and stronger than themselves until they were on the outskirts of the crowd. "Let us go to the Hofburg," said Marco. "They will come back there, and we shall see him again, even if we can't get near." To the Hofburg they made their way through the less crowded streets, and there they waited as near to the great palace as they could get. They were there when, the ceremonies at an end, the imperial carriages returned, but though they saw their man again, they were at some distance from him and he did not see them. Then followed 4 singular days. They were singular days because they were full of tantalizing incidents. Nothing seemed easier than to hear talk of and see the Emperor's favorite, but nothing was more impossible than to get near to him. He seemed rather a favorite with the populace, and the common people of the shopkeeping or laboring classes were given to talking freely of him, of where he was going and what he was doing. Tonight he would be sure to be at this great house or that, at this ball or that banquet. There was no difficulty in discovering that he would be sure to go to the opera, or the theatre, or to drive to the Schönbrunn with his imperial master. Marco and the Rat heard casual speech of him again and again, and from one part of the city to the other they followed and waited for him. But it was like chasing a will-o'-the-wisp. He was evidently too brilliant and important a person to be allowed to move about alone. There were always people with him who seemed absorbed in his languid, cynical talk. Marco thought that he never seemed to care much for his companions, though they on their part always seemed highly entertained by what he was saying. It was noticeable that they laughed a great deal, though he himself scarcely even smiled. "He's one of those chaps with the trick of saying witty things as if he didn't see the fun in them himself," the Rat summed him up. "Chaps like that are always cleverer than the other kind." "He's too high in favor and too rich not to be followed about," they heard a man in a shop say one day. "But he gets tired of it. Sometimes when he's too bored to stand it any longer, he gives it out that he's gone into the mountains somewhere, and all the time he's shut up alone with his pictures in his own palace." That very night the Rat came into their attic, looking pale and disappointed. He had been out to buy some food after a long and arduous day in which they had covered much ground, had seen their man 3 times, and each time under circumstances which made him more inaccessible than ever. They had come back to their poor quarters both tired and ravenously hungry. The Rat threw his purchase onto the table and himself into a chair. "He's gone to Budapest," he said. "Now how shall we find him?" Marco was rather pale also, and for a moment he looked paler. The day had been a hard one, and in their haste to reach places at a long distance from each other, they had forgotten their need of food. They sat silent for a few moments because there seemed to be nothing to say. "We are too tired and hungry to be able to think well," Marco said at last. "Let us eat our supper, and then go to sleep. Until we've had a rest, we must let go." "Yes, there's no good in talking when you're tired." The Rat answered a trifle gloomily. "You don't reason straight. We must let go." Their meal was simple, but they ate well and without words. Even when they had finished and undressed for the night, they said very little. "Where do our thoughts go when we are asleep?" the Rat inquired casually after he was stretched out in the darkness. "They must go somewhere. Let's send them to find out what to do next." "It's not as still as it was on the Geisberg. You could hear the city roaring," said Marco drowsily from his dark corner. "We must make a ledge for ourselves." Sleep made it for them. Deep, restful, healthy sleep. If they had been more resentful of their ill luck and lost labor, it would have come less easily and have been less natural. In their talks of strange things, they had learned that one great secret of strength and unflagging courage is to know how to let go, to cease thinking over an anxiety until the right moment comes. It was their habit to "let go" for hours sometimes, and wander about looking at places and things, galleries, museums, palaces, giving themselves up with boyish pleasure and eagerness to all they saw. Marco was too intimate with the things worth seeing, and the Rat too curious and feverishly wide awake, to allow of their missing much. The Rat's image of the world had grown until it seemed to know no boundaries which could hold its wealth of wonders. He wanted to go on and see them all. When Marco opened his eyes in the morning, he found the Rat lying looking at him. Then they both sat up in bed at the same time. "I believe we are both thinking the same thing," Marco said. They frequently discovered that they were thinking the same things. "So do I," answered the Rat. "It shows how tired we were that we didn't think of it last night. Yes, we are thinking the same thing," said Marco. "We have both remembered what we heard about his shutting himself up alone with his pictures and making people believe he had gone away." "He's in his palace now," the Rat announced. "Do you feel sure of that, too?" asked Marco. "Did you wake up and feel sure of it the first thing?" "Yes," answered the Rat. "As sure as if I'd heard him say it himself." "So did I," said Marco. "That's what our thoughts brought back to us," said the Rat, "when we let go and sent them off last night." He sat up, hugging his knees and looking straight before him for some time after this, and Marco did not interrupt his meditations. The day was a brilliant one, and, though their attic had only one window, the sun shone in through it as they ate their breakfast. After it, they leaned on the window's ledge and talked about the Prince's garden. They talked about it because it was a place open to the public, and they had walked round it more than once. The palace, which was not a large one, stood in the midst of it. The Prince was good-natured enough to allow quiet and well-behaved people to saunter through. It was not a fashionable promenade, but a pleasant retreat for people who sometimes took their work or books and sat on the seats placed here and there among the shrubs and flowers. "When we were there the first time, I noticed two things," Marco said. "There is a stone balcony which juts out from the side of the palace which looks on the fountain garden. That day there were chairs on it, as if the Prince and his visitors sometimes sat there. Near it there was a very large evergreen shrub, and I saw that there was a hollow place inside it. If some one wanted to stay in the gardens all night to watch the windows when they were lighted and see if any one came out alone upon the balcony, he could hide himself in the hollow place and stay there until the morning." "Is there room for two inside the shrub?" the Rat asked. "No, I must go alone," said Marco. End of chapter 24. Of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Frances Hodgson Burnett, Chapter 25. A Voice in the Night. Late that afternoon, there wandered about the gardens two quiet, inconspicuous, rather poorly dressed boys. They looked at the palace, the shrubs, and the flower beds, as strangers usually did, and they sat on the seats and talked as people were accustomed to seeing boys talk together. It was a sunny day and exceptionally warm, and there were more saunterers and sitters than usual, which was perhaps the reason why the portiere at the entrance gates gave such slight notice to the pair that he did not observe that, though two boys came in, only one went out. He did not, in fact, remember, when he saw the Rat swing by on his crutches at closing time, that he had entered in the company of a dark-haired lad who walked without any aid. It happened that, when the Rat passed out, the portiere at the entrance was much interested in the aspect of the sky, which was curiously threatening. There had been heavy clouds hanging about all day, and now and then blotting out the sunshine entirely, but the sun had refused to retire altogether. Just now, however, the clouds had piled themselves in thunderous, purplish mountains, and the sun had been forced to set behind them. "It's been a sort of battle since morning," the portiere said. "There will be some crashes and cataracts to-night." That was what The Rat had thought when they had sat in the fountain garden on a seat which gave them a good view of the balcony and the big evergreen shrub, which they knew had the hollow in the middle, though its circumference was so imposing. "If there should be a big storm, the evergreen will not save you much, though it may keep off the worst," The Rat said. "I wish there was room for two." He would have wished there was room for two if he had seen Marco marching to the stake. As the gardens emptied, the boys rose and walked around once more, as if on their way out. By the time they had sauntered toward the big evergreen, nobody was in the fountain garden, and the last loiterers were moving toward the arched stone entrance to the streets. When they drew near one side of the evergreen, the two were together. When The Rat swung out on the other side of it, he was alone. No one noticed that anything had happened. No one looked back. So The Rat swung down the walks and round the flower beds and passed into the street, and the portiere looked at the sky and made his remark about the crashes and cataracts. As the darkness came on, the hollow in the shrub seemed a very safe place. It was not in the least likely that any one would enter the closed gardens, and if by rare chance some servant passed through, he would not be in search of people who wished to watch all night in the middle of an evergreen instead of going to bed and to sleep. The hollow was well enclosed with greenery, and there was room to sit down when one was tired of standing. Marco stood for a long time, because by doing so, he could see plainly the windows opening on the balcony if he gently pushed aside some flexible young boughs. He had managed to discover in his first visit to the gardens that the windows overlooking the fountain garden were those which belonged to the Prince's own suite of rooms. Those which opened on to the balcony lighted his favorite apartment, which contained his best loved books and pictures, and in which he spent most of his secluded leisure hours. Marco watched these windows anxiously. If the Prince had not gone to Budapest, if he were really only in retreat and hiding from his gay world among his treasures, he would be living in his favorite rooms, and lights would show themselves. And if there were lights, he might pass before a window because, since he was enclosed in his garden, he need not fear being seen. The twilight deepened into darkness, and because of the heavy clouds, it was very dense. Faint gleams showed themselves in the lower part of the palace, but none was lighted in the windows Marco watched. He waited so long that it became evident that none was to be lighted at all. At last he loosed his hold on the young boughs and, after standing a few moments in thought, sat down upon the earth in the midst of his embowered tent. The Prince was not in his retreat. He was probably not in Vienna, and the rumor of his journey to Budapest had no doubt been true. So much time lost through making a mistake, but it was best to have made the venture. Not to have made it would have been to lose a chance. The entrance was closed for the night, and there was no getting out of the gardens until they were opened for the next day. He must stay in his hiding place until the time when people began to come and bring their books and knitting and sit on the seats. Then he could stroll out without attracting attention. But he had the night before him to spend as best he could. That would not matter at all. He could tuck his cap under his head and go to sleep on the ground. He could command himself to waken once every half hour and look for the lights. He would not go to sleep until it was long past midnight, so long past that there would not be one chance in 100 that anything could happen. But the clouds which made the night so dark were giving forth low, rumbling growls. At intervals, a threatening gleam of light shot across them and a sudden swish of wind rushed through the trees in the garden. This happened several times, and then Marco began to hear the patter of raindrops. They were heavy and big drops, but few at first, and then there was a new and more powerful rush of wind. A jagged dart of light in the sky, and a tremendous crash. After that, the clouds tore themselves open and poured forth their contents in floods. After the protracted struggle of the day, it all seemed to happen at once, as if a horde of huge lions had at one moment been let loose. Flame after flame of lightning, roar and crash and sharp reports of thunder, shrieks of hurricane wind, torrents of rain, as if some tidal wave of the skies had gathered and rushed and burst upon the earth. It was such a storm as people remember for a lifetime, and which in few lifetimes is seen at all. Marco stood still in the midst of the rage and flooding, blinding roar of it. After the first few minutes, he knew he could do nothing to shield himself. Down the garden paths he heard cataracts rushing. He held his cap pressed against his eyes because he seemed to stand in the midst of darting flames. The crashes, cannon reports and thunderings, and the jagged streams of light came so close to one another that he seemed deafened as well as blinded. He wondered if he should ever be able to hear human voices again when it was over. That he was drenched to the skin, and that the water poured from his clothes as if he himself were a cataract, was so small a detail that he was scarcely aware of it. He stood still, bracing his body, and waited. If he had been a Samavian soldier in the trenches, and such a storm had broken upon him and his comrades, they could only have braced themselves and waited. This was what he found himself thinking when the tumult and downpour were at their worst. There were men who had waited in the midst of a rain of bullets. It was not long after this thought had come to him that there occurred the first temporary lull in the storm. Its fury perhaps reached its height and broke at that moment. A yellow flame had torn its jagged way across the heavens, and an earth-rending crash had thundered itself into rumblings which actually died away before breaking forth again. Marco took his cap from his eyes and drew a long breath. He drew 2 long breaths. It was as he began drawing a third, and realizing the strange feeling of the almost stillness about him, that he heard a new kind of sound at the side of the garden nearest his hiding place. It sounded like the creak of a door opening somewhere in the wall behind the laurel hedge. Some one was coming into the garden by a private entrance. He pushed aside the young boughs again and tried to see, but the darkness was too dense. Yet he could hear if the thunder would not break again. There was the sound of feet on the wet gravel, the footsteps of more than one person coming toward where he stood, but not as if afraid of being heard, merely as if they were at liberty to come in by what entrance they chose. Marco remained very still. A sudden hope gave him a shock of joy. If the man with the tired face chose to hide himself from his acquaintances, he might choose to go in and out by a private entrance. The footsteps drew near, crushing the wet gravel, passed by, and seemed to pause somewhere near the balcony. And then flame lit up the sky again, and the thunder burst forth once more. But this was its last great peal. The storm was at an end. Only fainter and fainter rumblings and mutterings and paler darts followed. Even they were soon over, and the cataracts in the paths had rushed themselves silent. But the darkness was still deep. It was deep to blackness in the hollow of the evergreen. Marco stood in it, streaming with rain, but feeling nothing because he was full of thought. He pushed aside his greenery and kept his eyes on the place in the blackness where the windows must be, though he could not see them. It seemed that he waited a long time, but he knew it only seemed so, really. He began to breathe quickly because he was waiting for something. Suddenly he saw exactly where the windows were, because they were all lighted. His feeling of relief was great, but it did not last very long. It was true that something had been gained in the certainty that his man had not left Vienna. But what next? It would not be so easy to follow him if he chose only to go out secretly at night. What next? To spend the rest of the night watching a lighted window was not enough. Tomorrow night it might not be lighted. But he kept his gaze fixed upon it. He tried to fix all his will and thought power on the person inside the room. Perhaps he could reach him and make him listen, even though he would not know that any one was speaking to him. He knew that thoughts were strong things. If angry thoughts in one man's mind will create anger in the mind of another, Why should not sane messages cross the line? I must speak to you. I must speak to you, he found himself saying in a low, intense voice. I am outside here waiting. Listen, I must speak to you. He said it many times, and kept his eyes fixed upon the window which opened on to the balcony. Once he saw a man's figure cross the room, but he could not be sure who it was. The last distant rumblings of thunder had died away and the clouds were breaking. It was not long before the dark mountainous billows broke apart, and a brilliant full moon showed herself sailing in the rift, suddenly flooding everything with light. Parts of the garden were silver white, and the tree shadows were like black velvet. A silvery lance pierced even into the hollow of Marco's evergreen and struck across his face. Perhaps it was this sudden change which attracted the attention of those inside the balconied room. A man's figure appeared at the long windows. Marco saw now that it was the Prince. He opened the windows and stepped out onto the balcony. "It is all over," he said quietly, and he stood with his face lifted, looking at the great white sailing moon. He stood very still and seemed for the moment to forget the world and himself. It was a wonderful triumphant queen of a moon. But something brought him back to earth. A low but strong and clear boy voice came up to him from the garden path below. "The lamp is lighted. The lamp is lighted," it said, and the words sounded almost as if someone were uttering a prayer. They seemed to call to him, to arrest him, to draw him. He stood still a few seconds in dead silence. Then he bent over the balustrade. The moonlight had not broken the darkness below. "That is a boy's voice," he said in a low tone, "but I cannot see who is speaking." "Yes, it is a boy's voice," it answered, in a way which somehow moved him, because it was so ardent. "It is the son of Stefan Loristan. The lamp is lighted." "Wait. I am coming down to you," the Prince said. In a few minutes Marco heard a door open gently not far from where he stood. Then the man he had been following so many days appeared at his side. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Before the gates closed. I hid myself in the hollow of the big shrub there, Highness," Marco answered. "Then you were out in the storm?" "Yes, Highness." The Prince put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "I cannot see you, but it is best to stand in the shadow. You are drenched to the skin." "I have been able to give your Highness the sign," Marco whispered. "A storm is nothing." There was a silence. Marco knew that his companion was pausing to turn something over in his mind. "So," he said slowly at length, "the lamp is lighted and you are sent to bear the sign." Something in his voice made Marco feel that he was smiling. "What a race you are! What a race, you Samavian Loristans!" He paused as if to think the thing over again. "I want to see your face," he said next. "Here is a tree with a shaft of moonlight striking through the branches. Let us step aside and stand under it." Marco did as he was told. The shaft of moonlight fell upon his uplifted face and showed its young strength and darkness, quite splendid for the moment in a triumphant glow of joy in obstacles overcome. Raindrops hung on his hair, but he did not look draggled, only very wet and picturesque. He had reached his man. He had given the sign. The Prince looked him over with interested curiosity. "Yes," he said in his cool, rather dragging voice. "You are the son of Stefan Loristan. Also you must be taken care of. You must come with me. I have trained my household to remain in its own quarters until I require its service. I have attached to my own apartments a good, safe little room where I sometimes keep people. You can dry your clothes and sleep there. When the gardens are opened again, the rest will be easy." But though he stepped out from under the trees and began to move toward the palace in the shadow, Marco noticed that he moved hesitatingly, as if he had not quite decided what he should do. He stopped rather suddenly and turned again to Marco, who was following him. "There is some one in the room I just now left," he said. "An old man, whom it might interest to see you. It might also be a good thing for him to feel interest in you. I choose that he shall see you as you are." "I am at your command, Highness," Marco answered. He knew his companion was smiling again. "You have been in training for more centuries than you know," he said, "and your father has prepared you to encounter the unexpected without surprise." They passed under the balcony and paused at a low stone doorway hidden behind shrubs. The door was a beautiful one, Marco saw when it was opened, and the corridor disclosed was beautiful also, though it had an air of quiet and aloofness which was not so much secret as private. A perfect though narrow staircase mounted from it to the next floor. After ascending it, the Prince led the way through a short corridor and stopped at the door at the end of it. "We are going in here," he said. It was a wonderful room, the one which opened onto the balcony. Every piece of furniture in it, the hangings, the tapestries, and the pictures on the wall were all such as might well have found themselves adorning a museum. Marco remembered the common report of his escort's favorite amusement of collecting wonders and furnishing his house with the things others exhibited only as marvels of art and handicraft. The place was rich and mellow with exquisitely chosen beauties. In a massive chair upon the hearth sat a figure with bent head. It was a tall old man with white hair and mustache. His elbows rested upon the arm of his chair, and he leaned his forehead on his hand, as if he were weary. Marco's companion crossed the room and stood beside him, speaking in a lowered voice. Marco could not at first hear what he said. He himself stood quite still, waiting. The white-haired man lifted his head and listened. It seemed as though, almost at once, he was singularly interested. The lowered voice was slightly raised at last, and Marco heard the last two sentences. "The only son of Stefan Loristan. Look at him." The old man in the chair turned slowly and looked, steadily and with questioning curiosity touched with grave surprise. He had keen and clear blue eyes. Then Marco, still erect and silent, waited again. The Prince had merely said to him, "An old man whom it might interest to see you." He had plainly intended that, whatsoever happened, he must make no outward sign of seeing more than he had been told he would see an old man. It was for him to show no astonishment or recognition. He had been brought here not to see but to be seen. The power of remaining still under scrutiny, which The Rat had often envied him, stood now in good stead, because he had seen the white head and tall form not many days before, surmounted by brilliant emerald plumes and hung with jeweled decorations, in the royal carriage, escorted by banners and helmets, and following troops whose tramping feet kept time to bursts of military music while the populace bared their heads and cheered. "He is like his father," this personage said to the Prince. "But if any one but Loristan had sent him, his looks please me." Then suddenly to Marco, "You were waiting outside while the storm was going on?" "Yes, sir," Marco answered. Then the two exchanged some words still in the lowered voice. "You read the news as you made your journey?" he was asked. "You know how Samavia stands?" "She does not stand," said Marco. "The Iarovitch and the Maranovitch have fought as hyenas fight, until each has torn the other into fragments, and neither has blood or strength left." The two glanced at each other. "A good simile," said the older person. "You are right. If a strong party rose, and a greater power chose not to interfere, the country might see better days." He looked at him a few moments longer, and then waved his hand kindly. "You are a fine Samavian," he said. "I am glad of that. You may go. Good night." Marco bowed respectfully, and the man with the tired face led him out of the room. It was just before he left him in the small quiet chamber in which he was to sleep that the Prince gave him a final curious glance. "I remember now," he said. In the room when you answered the question about Samavia, I was sure I had seen you before. It was the day of the celebration. There was a break in the crowd, and I saw a boy looking at me. It was you." "Yes," said Marco. "I have followed you each time you have gone out since then, but I could never get near enough to speak. To-night seemed only one chance in 1,000." "You are doing your work more like a man than a boy," was the next speech, and it was made reflectively. "No man could have behaved more perfectly than you did just now, when discretion and composure were necessary." Then, after a moment's pause, "He was deeply interested and deeply pleased. Good night." When the gardens had been thrown open the next morning and people were passing in and out again, Marco passed out also. He was obliged to tell himself 2 or 3 times that he had not awakened from an amazing dream. He quickened his pace after he had crossed the street because he wanted to get home to the attic and talk to The Rat. There was a narrow side street it was necessary for him to pass through if he wished to make a short cut. As he turned into it, he saw a curious figure leaning on crutches against a wall. It looked damp and forlorn, and he wondered if it could be a beggar. It was not. It was The Rat, who suddenly saw who was approaching and swung forward. His face was pale and haggard, and he looked worn and frightened. He dragged off his cap and spoke in a voice which was as hoarse as a crow's. "God be thanked!" he said. "God be thanked!" as people always said it when they received the sign alone. But there was a kind of anguish in his voice as well as relief. "Aide de camp!" Marco cried out. The Rat had begged him to call him so. "What have you been doing? How long have you been here?" "Ever since I left you last night," said The Rat, clutching tremblingly at his arm as if to make sure he was real. "If there was not room for 2 in the hollow, there was room for 1 in the street. Was it my place to go off duty and leave you alone? Was it? You were out in the storm?" "Weren't you?" said The Rat fiercely. "I huddled against the wall as well I could. What did I care? Crutches don't prevent a fellow waiting. I wouldn't have left you if you'd given me orders. And that would have been mutiny. When you did not come out as soon as the gates opened, I felt as if my head got on fire. How could I know what had happened? I've not the nerve and backbone you have. I go half mad." For a second or so Marco did not answer. But when he put his hand on the damp sleeve, The Rat actually started, because it seemed as though he was looking into the eyes of Stefan Loristan. "You look just like your father!" he exclaimed in spite of himself. "How tall you are!" "When you are near me," Marco said in Loristan's own voice, "when you are near me, I feel as if I were a royal prince attended by an army. You are my army." And he pulled off his cap with quick boyishness and added, "God be thanked!" The sun was warm in the attic window when they reached their lodging, and the two leaned on the rough sill as Marco told his story. It took some time to relate, and when he ended, he took an envelope from his pocket and showed it to The Rat. It contained a flat package of money. "He gave it to me just before he opened the private door," Marco explained, "and he said to me, 'It will not be long now. After Samavia, go back to London as quickly as you can. As quickly as you can.'" "I wonder what he meant," The Rat said slowly. A tremendous thought had shot through his mind, but it was not a thought he could speak of to Marco. "I cannot tell. I thought it was for some reason he did not expect me to know," Marco said. "We will do as he told us, as quickly as we can." They looked over the newspapers as they did every day. All that could be gathered from any of them was that the opposing armies of Samavia seemed each to have reached the culmination of disaster and exhaustion. Which party had the power left to take any final step which could call itself a victory, it was impossible to say. Never had a country been in a more desperate case. "It is the time," said The Rat, glowering over his map. "If the Secret Party rises suddenly now, it can take Melzarr almost without a blow. It can sweep through the country and disarm both armies. They're weakened, they're half starved, they're bleeding to death. They want to be disarmed. Only the Yarovitch and the Maranovitch keep on with the struggle because each is fighting for the power to tax the people and make slaves of them. If the secret party does not rise, the people will, and they'll rush on the palaces and kill every Maranovitch and Yarovitch they find, and serve them right." "Let us spend the rest of the day in studying the road map again," said Marco. "To-night we must be on the way to Samavia." Chapter 26